it's Nina. Thanks so much for joining me today. I have the pleasure of joining Newton's Nook today for their 4th anniversary blog hop celebration. Newton's Nook is one of my favorite stamp companies. I was on their design team for a while and love their stamps and love Jen and Jeff from Newton's Nook. They are some of the nicest people you'll ever meet. So what I've got here are a couple of the new products that are from their newest release. This is the Winston's Lake House stamp set. And I've also got the new Waves stencil, which stencils are new for Newton's Nook. And I really like that they're coming out with these that coordinate so perfectly with their products. I'm going to be doing some coloring today on some Bristol Smooth paper from Canson. This is the first time I've used this paper, and I really liked the results that I got from it. It's a little more on the thinner side, so it's not quite as thick as a normal watercolor paper, but it holds up to the alcohol marker coloring that I'm going to be doing today using some Nuvo markers from Tonic Studios. So I'm going to start off by stamping my images from the Winston's Lake House stamp set onto the Bristol Smooth paper, and I'm using some Simon Says Stamp black ink for this. I'm using my Misty so that I can go ahead and double stamp those images to make sure I get a nice dark impression, and now we'll be able to start working on the coloring. For the coloring, I'm using these markers, like I mentioned, from Tonic Studios. These are from the Nuvo line, and these are their alcohol markers, so very much like a Copic marker. The one fun thing about these markers is that they come in color families, so it makes blending so easy. You can find the color set that you want and be able to use those markers from that set. Now, I'm showing you a quick look at the markers here. They have a chisel nib on one end and a bullet nib on the other. The bullet nib is great for coloring in stamped images like I'm doing here today, so I'm going to do all of my coloring with that bullet nib. Here's a great example of how I can use those markers to color in my images, and I'm using these 3 colors from that same color family. Same thing with the red. I'm using 3 colors of red, which are all from the same color family, and they blend so well together and create really nice shading effects. Here I'm using some of the lighter brown colors, and as you can see, you can even blend colors that are not part of the color family. So here I've got a darker brown, which is actually from a different color family, but it still blends really nicely with the lighter brown from another brown color family. I really liked how these markers reacted together and created nice shaded and blended effects. I also liked how they reacted with the Bristol Smooth paper. This Bristol Smooth paper from Canson is, like I said, a newer paper for me. If I use a Bristol Smooth paper, I usually use the one from Strathmore, but I saw this one and I thought I'd give it a try. And I really liked the results I got with markers. I have not tried it yet with watercolors, and because it's on the thinner side, I'm not sure how well it's going to hold up to a lot of heavy watercoloring, so I'm curious as to see what it will do. But for marker coloring, I really liked this, and these markers do bleed a little bit, just like alcohol markers from Copic do. I find that they did bleed through this paper a little bit, but really not too bad. So if you're looking for a good marker paper, I would really recommend trying this one out, because I noticed too that it held up to the coloring really nicely. It didn't bleed so much as regular cardstock. So I also find that because these Nuvo markers are a little bit more on the wetter side, that if I use them on regular cardstock, they have a tendency to bleed a little bit faster. And they didn't bleed as quickly on the Bristol Smooth paper here that I'm using as it did on regular cardstock. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Another great thing about these Nuvo markers is that you can layer colors together to get new colors. So here I'm blending gray and brown together to get a warmer grayish tone for my bird. And you can see that these colors layer together really well, and I was able to get a really nice color blend for that little duck, and really creates a nice bit of interest to the coloring. I also used a white gel pen to add some details. Here I'm using some darker browns and adding some shading underneath the bear and the dog. And that dog, I think, is just so cute. I'm really excited that Newton's Nook is bringing in more critters to their line of stamps. They always have had Newton, and of course Newton for sure needs to be in all of the stamp sets because I love cats for one, and plus Newton, it's his namesake for the company. So we cannot ever forget Newton. But I love that Jennifer, who designs all these stamps for Newton's Nook, she does such a great job of creating all these extra animals and little friends to go with Newton. And Winston is one of my favorite. There are some great Winston stamp sets that I think are so much fun and I have loved using on my cards. here I'm finishing up my coloring by coloring in the cute little cabin. We're going to be creating a scene with all of these images that I'm using here. And so that's why you're seeing me color in all of these different images. Now there are coordinating dies that go with this stamp set. I don't have them, but if you are interested in getting them, you can. So if you want to be able to go ahead and cut these out like I did here, I used some fine tip scissors to fussy cut these out, but you can get coordinating dies. So I would encourage you to check out Newton's Nook and find those dies for the stamp set. So now I'm moving on to creating some elements for my scene. I'm bringing in the wave stencil here and I'm adding some micro pour tape along the edges to hold my paper to the stencil. This time I'm using watercolor paper because I want this to hold up to all of the ink blending and the watercoloring that I'm going to be doing here. So I'm going to go ahead and start by blending on some distress ink colors to create some water. Now what I did with this stencil to create a more interesting effect was I added a layer of the wave stencil onto my paper. Then I took the stencil off and repositioned it, and this time I'm taking a different color of ink and sponging that onto the stencil. That's going to create a really cool layered effect, but I'm going to step it up even more by taking the stencil off once again and reapplying it in a totally different spot, and then I'm going to add more ink on top of that. So it's going to look like a crazy hot mess. It's going to look pretty silly. After I've added all of this ink layered on top of each other, it's going to look like a twisted mess. But after I apply the water and get this color blending, that's when you're going to see this water come to life. So here I've got my mister bottle, and I'm going to spritz this really heavily with water and get all of that color really moving. As it moves, it's starting to travel across and blend into each other and kind of create some mixes of different blues and also soften those harder edges so it's not going to look quite so intense, and that layered effect's going to blend together better and it's going to look more like water. And you can see here already, before I've cut this down with these wave dies from Mama Elephant, it's already looking more like water, and that layering really added some interest to the water and created a really neat effect. So I ran those border dies through my Big Shot machine with that paper, and now I've got some pieces that I can use for creating the water in my scene. I also needed to die cut some grass to put in the background of my scene. So I've taken a little stitched hill here, and I'm going to go ahead and ink this up with some mowed lawn distress ink. I cut this from some green cardstock and I added that ink just to give it some interest. I also cut another piece of watercolor paper, and I'm going to use that as my background. Here I'm going to start layering these pieces together so you can get an idea of the direction that I'm going with my scene. So I'm going to have my little cabin in the background, I'm going to have the water in the front, and Winston and his boat nestled in between the water. And then I'll have some of those other supporting elements mixed in also. Before I go any further though, I need to add some sky to my background. So I'm taking that white piece of watercolor paper that I had trimmed down with that rectangle. I'm going to add some yellow distress ink onto a watercolor palette, and I'm going to dab the paper into the ink to get some ink smooshing onto the background to create a yellow sky. I thought the yellow matched really nicely with the colors that I have going on in this card, plus it adds a nice bit of sunset interest to the scene. I added some water splatters, this time with my distress sprayer, because the distress sprayer gives some really neat varied water droplets if you spray it only halfway. So I was able to get some really nice water droplets and splatters in my background to give the background a little bit more variation. You can see the texture that those water droplets added and really makes this whole scene come to life. So now that I've got my scene elements ready to go, I'm going to start off by stamping my sentiment. My sentiment I want in different colors, so I'm going to cut the sentiment apart. That way I'll be able to ink up the different pieces in different colors. But I need to line them all back up together so that way I can put them into my MISTI tool and know that everything's in the exact place that it needs to be. So I'm going to start by stamping the two smaller sentiments first. I'm going to remove the big word in between those two smaller lines of text. I'm going to take some brown ink, this is some Cup of Joe from Hero Arts, and I'll ink those little sentiments up. Once I've inked them up, I'll press them down onto my background with my MISTI. Then I'll be able to open that back up and reapply the larger sentiment back in between where it was with the two smaller supporting sentiments. After I've added that in, I can now take the smaller pieces off and this time ink up just the larger word. And this one I'm going to ink up in some lipstick red ink from Simon Says Stamp. And I did stamp this twice to get it a little bit darker than the first impression that it was. After I've had my sentiment stamped down onto my background, I'm attaching the scene elements down. I adhere the grassy hill with some regular tape runner along with the cabin. For the water, I added a layer of foam tape behind each one. So this one here, I've put a layer of foam tape down. This is the first layer of water. I'll attach that. Then I'm going to bring in the second piece of water and I'm going to add some foam tape onto that one as well. That's going to give some depth here to our scene. I needed to trim that foam tape down a little bit to make it a small enough strip. After I've added that tape onto the back, I can also figure out where Winston's going to end up going, and I'm attaching him down with some regular tape runner adhesive. I'll be able to nestle him in between the wave, so I'm going to make sure that I don't press that down before I have Winston attached. Then I can press the water down once I have Winston in place. So here I've got some reeds and grass, and I've got actually 3 of those that I'm going to nestle in between different areas. And then I also need to attach my duck. My duck I'm going to adhere with some tape runner. And then I've also got the lily pad as well. So all of these different elements, I think, just layered up together really nicely and created a really fun scene. This whole scene reminds me of some sort of like White Mountains or interior Maine cabin feels. It's just, there's tons of woods and lakes in the interior portions of New England. And this totally reminds me of something that you would find back there. I added some Nuvo drops in some white on top of the duck, and then I also added some jewel drops in the blue to add onto the windows of my cabin. Just to add a little bit of extra embellishment and interest to the scene. And then I did add the whole entire scene onto some Desert Storm cardstock, which I had flicked some brown ink onto just to give a little bit of more of an organic feel to the paper. So that's going to finish up my scene card for today for the Newton's Nook 4th anniversary blog hop celebration. If you head on over to my blog, you can get more information on the blog hop, including giveaways, so you definitely don't want to miss that. I also have still pictures and products used listed over at my blog, and there's also a product list down in the video description as well. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more inspiration. I will see you again very soon, and have a fabulous day. Bye!